Hello, everyone. I'm Casey Dinges, Executive Advisor for the American Society of Civil Engineers. Thanks for joining me today for a discussion on enhancing infrastructure for wildfire prevention and resilience. My guest today is Geoff Coleman, Vice President of BKF Engineers in Santa Rosa, California. Geoff is a wildfire resilience expert who's worked with local fire code officials for several years and has helped draft many of the city's fire policies. Recently, his company has helped hundreds of people rebuild their homes after being lost to wildfires. Welcome, Geoff.
Thank you for having me, Casey. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you today.
So, Geoff, in 2020, America's western states saw the worst wildfire season in 70 years. Tens of thousands of people were forced to evacuate and endured what was considered the worst air quality in the world. Smoke from the fires spread to the country's east coast and even across the Atlantic to Europe. Now, civil engineers and city leaders are under more pressure than ever to safeguard infrastructure and protect communities from climate crises. So let's get into it, Geoff. First, what elements of infrastructure are most vulnerable to wildfires?
That's a good question, Casey. Infrastructure elements that people generally think of as being the most vulnerable to wildfires, are buildings, particularly those having combustible exterior, such as wood, because there's a direct and noticeable consequence when somebody loses their home to wildfire. In a broader sense, vulnerable infrastructure that people might not think about include communication systems, our water supply, gas service, our electric grid, and our transportation network. Many of our communications towers are located in hilltops in the middle of wildland areas, and it's extremely important that these remain operational so that emergency responders can communicate with each other and with the public. One of the challenges that we encountered in Santa Rosa when the Tubbs fire took nearly 6,000 structures overnight was the shortage of water for firefighting. And it wasn't the firefighting effort that depleted our supply. We lost a lot of water due to homes being burned to the ground. And it doesn't take long to diminish our municipal water supply when thousands of homes are lost at once, leaving these mini geysers at the end of each water service where a home once stood. Municipal water systems ran dry. Our plastic pipes serving these homes were burned. And contaminated water from the burned plastic was drawn from these services back into our water mains. This resulted in benzene levels in the water supply system. And, some of the infrastructure needed to be replaced while other portions needed to be flushed to reduce benzene levels. On the dry utility side, we had to shut down entire grids of gas and electric systems because the services couldn't be easily isolated from the burn areas. And this left people inside and outside the burn zones without gas and power for days. I mentioned our transportation systems. Our transportation systems were overburdened when tens of thousands of people evacuated the city at the same time. And in many situations having to evacuate in the same direction. But this was only a temporary impact. Our transportation systems were more permanently compromised, and following the cleanup and reconstruction effort. It's been nearly 4 years since the Tubbs fire, and we still have miles of asphalt roads, concrete sidewalks, and other infrastructure that's in dire need of repair, after being exposed to heavy truck traffic and construction equipment. The infrastructure wasn't designed for all this, and, it really shouldn't be because it wouldn't be economical to do that.
Yeah. So moving on then, so how do you build infrastructure and buildings that are wildfire resilient?
That's a good question, Casey, and that's the challenge. We've learned that in the worst conditions, when we have strong winds and low humidity, nothing is fireproof. The best we can do is build infrastructure that is wildfire resilient. And, this is typically accomplished by building structures with fire-resistant materials and providing suitable access structures, ample water supply, and, really making sure that we provide plenty of defensible space so we give firefighters a fighting chance and without putting them at risk. This typically entails things like, removing fuel within 100 feet of structures when you're in a burn zone, pruning trees up to a height of 8 feet, removing firewood, dead trees, leaves, branches, needles from around your home, making sure that your roof and gutters are clean, mowing the grass, separating trees so that there are at least 10 feet between canopies, and using fuel breaks such as walks, roads, driveways, and greenbelt areas. As a homeowner, we want to make it easy for firefighters to access your property, clear thin brush within 10 feet of roads accessing the property, and definitely remove combustible materials in close proximity to your home. During the Sonoma County wildfires, we have observed large embers being cast hundreds of feet and igniting combustible material at the base of homes. We need to keep in mind that defensible space, it saves communities, not just our home, because these fire breaks help control the spread of wildfire.
So when you're planning a new community, what can civil engineers do to make the community more wildfire resilient?
When possible, build critical infrastructure serving our communities, such as water tanks, cell towers, power substations outside of fire-prone areas, or at least try to mitigate the effects of the fire by increasing defensible space. When designing communities, civil engineers are usually tasked with helping ensure that the development has appropriate access to water supply. This typically means that we've got to provide paved roads having the capability of supporting emergency vehicle access, or emergency access vehicles. Having a clear width of at least 20 feet, and this is generally sufficient width to allow emergency vehicles to access the fire while people evacuate. We need to include compliant turnarounds, which is something that engineers take into consideration. In larger developments in wildfire-prone areas, should be equipped with multiple points of egress. When we look at these and consider a second point of egress, it's best to have them separated apart, separated by approximately half the diagonal of the area being served. One of the things that we observed during the Sonoma County wildfires is that the fire had traveled fence lines from house to house. And consideration might be given with future development to using fire-resistant fence materials, maybe for the last panel that's attached to the house or within 10 feet of structures.
So you mentioned local officials. So along those lines, what should city leaders and planners prioritize in their efforts right now to protect their communities?
That's a really good question. Each city, county, and town are required to have a general plan. This is essentially a vision for how the city will develop in the next 15 to 20 years. And when updating their general plan, city leaders, they might promote higher density in urban areas and limit density in wildfire-prone areas. When access, I should say safe access, water supply and defensible space can't be achieved. City leaders might also consider engaging fire code officials, when drafting their general plans, get them involved early in the process so that they can weigh in. Saving lives is a firefighter's first priority. And so, they can't focus on extinguishing a fire until everybody's safe. When an area has been safely evacuated, we give firefighters an opportunity to focus their effort on extinguishing the fire. Therefore, municipalities might consider preparing or improving in those situations where they've got an existing evacuation plan, improving those evacuation plans, and then doing really precisely what ASC is doing today, Casey, and that's educating the public.
Mm-hmm. So how can we, ASC, there's been a lot of talk about sustainability over the years, not just ASC, across many communities. So how can we promote sustainability while creating wildfire resilient infrastructure?
That is a challenging question. And, there are admittedly some competing interests when it comes to sustainability and creating a wildfire resilient environment. It's timing is funny, but, just last week in my area, residents in my neighborhood received letters from our local water district. And with it came a plea to remove our green lawns, our lush green lawns. Not that I've got a lush green lawn, but to remove our green lawns, which are in some situations a little bit more fire resilient, and replace them with drought resistant plants. And the letter encouraged the use of mulch and talked about the benefits of mulch and the nutrients that it creates for our playing environment. But to use mulch on the ground surface to help hold moisture in, because it's sustainable and helps reduce water use. And this is a frequently preached water efficient landscape measure. And one example of, a competing interest that I was referring to, wood, bark, and mulch, particularly gorilla home mulch, are very combustible and probably shouldn't be used in close proximity to structures in wildfire prone areas. Instead, we might use something like a rock garden, low water use plants that retain water, such as succulents, within close proximity to homes. We also want to avoid plants that have sap and oil within that defensible space area. As an example, although juniper might be drought tolerant, it's a poor choice when planting up against your home.
Mm-hmm. So what can be done to protect a community that's already in an area prone to wildfires? It's
You know,
already an issue. So they're behind the eight ball already.
they are, and I think the big thing is really education. Um, make sure that people understand the risks involved with living in wildfire-prone areas, and how to mitigate these risks by providing plenty of defensible space. Those that do live in wildfire-prone areas really should have essentials ready to go in the event of emergency, in case they need to evacuate.
Mhm. Um, I saw recently the iconic Pacific Coast Highway was taken out by a mudslide that I presume was related to wildfire damage that had taken out the vegetation, and then the rains come, and then the mudslides come, and so we've lost this. I think in two places along the coastline, the highway's been taken out.
And that's precisely what happens. That actually happened out here, yeah, on our coast. Fortunately, here in Sonoma County, we haven't had that many mudslides, and it was just because we didn't have a lot of rain immediately after our fires. But that is a challenge. When you've got rain, you've got a lot of runoff, especially concentrated runoff in hillside terrain. I was out for a walk, a hike up in the mountains, and I'm always looking at things like that. My girlfriend, she's always asking, "Hey, what are you looking at?" And it might be a ravine or a place where we were experiencing erosion. And yeah, we do see those types of things where whenever you've got concentrated water, not so much where you've got the sheet flow, but where you've lost vegetation, and it's really that root structure that holds that soil together. When we lose those elements, it makes it really easy for there to be a debris flow. And we have had several of those in Sonoma County. Not as bad as I thought, but they definitely have occurred.
Geoff, do you feel like we're facing more of a challenge in California than we were 5 or 10 years ago? Or has it always been a challenge?
It's kind of one of those things like flooding. We model our floods based on 10, 2,500 years. And just because we've got a 100-year event doesn't mean it's going to happen only every 100 years. And so it's really hard to say. With our fires, especially in Sonoma County, we've had a lot of fires recently. And, what's driven those fires for us have been kind of that prevailing wind coming out of the Northeast. It's been low humidity, high wind, and those are the things that we need to watch out for. And so we've noticed a lot more of it here, especially in Northern California in recent years. I mean, we've had fires back to back. It's probably a combination of things. It's probably a combination of climate change. I've heard a lot of things that our years are getting drier. I don't know that that's the case, looking at it from a fire perspective or a firefighter's perspective. Sometimes it's after we have our wettest years that we can have a problem. If we've got a really wet year and then, things tend to dry out. When we get a lot of rain or a lot of water, fuel tends to grow. Grass is really tall, bushes are thriving, and then we'll get those winds that come out of the Northeast for us. That are coming inland, not the ones that are coming off the shore, but that are coming from the inland. It tends to dry out our vegetation pretty quickly. And, we had another fire back in the 60s. It was the Hanley fire that actually burned a very similar burn scar to our Tubbs fire. And so, our Tubbs fire that came through Sonoma County in 2017 that took out, as I mentioned, nearly 6,000 structures. It happened overnight. And with very little warning. And it was because we had those high winds. We had winds that were, 60 plus miles an hour and well over 80 miles an hour, approaching 100 miles an hour up in the hills in certain situations. But, I don't know that that was attributed to climate change per se. We have noticed a difference. We've noticed that some of the days are getting windier. It's getting a little bit drier earlier. We've noticed that temperatures have risen a couple of degrees. But, to draw a parallel, if we were to look at the Hanley fire back in the 60s, it really burned. It was a very, very similar burn scar. And so to say that, things are more aggressive due to climate change now, I think that's one of the contributors, but not the only. I think that it's a combination of things. I mentioned defensible space. I think that we probably ought to create those green belts, defensible space, and thin vegetation. It's one of the things that I noticed when I was a kid a little bit more. Was I noticed a lot more controlled burns. You had controlled burns down in Southern California, and we don't see as much of that anymore.
Geoff, thank you for joining me today for this important discussion on building wildfire resilient infrastructure.
Thank you for having me, Casey. It's been a pleasure speaking this morning.
For more information on ASCE's Interchange series, visit asce.org/interchange. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on ASCE's Interchange Live.